Giving. Okay, I think we should be good. And just to contextualize it, I asked, at the risk of embarrassing myself, if anyone has ever told you that you look like David Lynch before, and you were just telling me a story.
Yeah, so the David Lynch one, I've heard a number of times, but now a number of people have stopped me, especially when I travel. And this happened, my wife and I were in, I forget where we were now. We were in Florida a couple of days ago, and I got stopped again, and someone said, "Are you John Larroquette?" He
Hmm.
was a comedian. He was in a show called Night Court, which is a TV show from the, I don't know, the 90s.
Okay.
And John Larroquette looks very different than John Larroquette used to look.
Sure.
But for some reason, people have freeze framed me. And I even had one woman once, I remember this one because I was in San Francisco and she stopped me. I said, no. And she said, yes, you are. And I said, I'm not. I promise I'm not. She said, you really are him and you're just trying to fake me out. I'm like, I'm not that guy.
Yeah. Do
So,
you walk through airports with scarves? Is there anything that would
yeah,
make you?
right. In this most recent one, the John Larroquette thing, the guy who asked me that, I said, I'm not John Larroquette. And he said, okay. And then he paused and he said, but really, you really are him, aren't you? And I said, I'm not him. So
That's wild.
yeah, it's very strange to be mistaken for somebody else.
How many times do you think that would have to happen until you're like, I actually am?
Right. Then I could just start saying that. And then maybe it would
I'm
all
on
go
my way
away.
to an audition. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Too funny.
Yeah.
So you were saying before that you're going now from I don't know how many classes to one class. How many classes were you teaching
So I
previously?
typically will teach 2 or 3 classes a semester at Swarthmore College. But because of the nature of my appointment, I can sometimes whittle it down to just one class.
Hmm.
This is a class that's actually been controversial because the class is called Radical Jesus. I
Great start.
study, yeah, so I study Jesus historically, but I use uh, some contemporary methods to understand who Jesus is, or who Jesus was. And part of what I'm interested in is queer theory and the way in which Jesus can be understood as non-binary. I think Jesus, insofar as he existed biologically, was a male at birth, but he's not gender conforming. He doesn't easily fit into typical masculine behavior. And but by just raising the question of understanding Jesus from a non-binary perspective, um, that triggered a whole
Sure.
avalanche of negative attention from more culturally conservative types of people and groups. So that class then got, because I put the syllabus onto the internet. I mean, anybody could,
Sure.
in that sense, visit the class and see what we're doing. Um, the syllabus got picked up on, and a number of conservative groups have railed against me because of that class.
Wow. Huh. I have probably 1,000 questions. I mean, the name Radical Jesus, you could have just named it the historical Jesus, right?
Right, right.
Is there a part of you that's sort of like you kind of like the controversy, or is there a part of you that's like, oh God, I've done it again?
No, I think I welcome controversy, discourse, interaction, energy around religious studies, biblical topics,
Hmm.
Christian ideas. I think it can become, the problem is that, just to talk about the Christian religion, it can sort of become the 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 province or the special possession of a few clerical types or defenders of orthodoxy or church folks, and nobody then can ask any questions.
Hmm.
Nobody can challenge conventional thinking. And then the religion, to me, um, doesn't have the energy and doesn't have the excitement that should attach to it when we can ask these questions. So what I do in that class, Radical Jesus, radical in the sense of getting back to the foundations. So a lot of biblical study. We do a lot of work in Greek, and the New Testament was written in Greek. I try to teach the students some rudimentary Greek so that they can use lexical tools for that purpose. But then radical also in the sense that, as I was saying, we bring different critical theories to the understanding of who Jesus is. So so-called critical race theory, queer theory, political thought, or what I would call post-colonial political thought, environmental studies. So it really makes the class much more interesting than it would be otherwise. I mean, for example, this, if you think about it, how did Jesus become white?
Sure.
Like, what is that?
Right.
Here's this Palestinian, right, person from 2,000 years ago, dark to medium complected, somebody who has, Middle Eastern Semitic ties, but he becomes this Nordic, fair-haired white man. And that has a lot to do, how that happened, that evolution over time, has a lot to do with Western cultural thinking about race and about ethnicity. And you can call that critical race theory, but I just call it asking questions about how did the Son of God evolve to the point that he became this really kind of radiant Nordic Viking guy? And that kind of a question is the sort of question, those are the kinds of questions that we ask in the class about traditional understandings of Jesus, and then how we can bring new insights to that to better understand who Jesus was and what his message is today.
And you can tell me if you don't want to go too deep down this road, but do you have an initial sense of how early that, I don't know how to describe it, that whitening started happening?
Yeah, the whitening. It wasn't in the early centuries of the Christian movement. And race and ethnicity in those days were understood differently. And Jesus wasn't, I don't think what we would think of now as race and ethnicity, I don't think that was particularly important. As Christianity evolved from its geographical origins to Europe, and as Europe, now we're going into the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries of the Common Era. So 500, 600, 700 years after the birth of Jesus, became more race conscious. There was actually a forged document that ostensibly was written at the time of Jesus's life about his physical appearance, but it was a forged document that made its way through the medieval European Christian society, which understood him to be fair-haired, white complected, and so forth. And that became a kind of paradigm for people then in Western art to understand who Jesus was and what he looked like. Part of what I do in the class is we study, of all things, Egyptian funeral portraits that are on sarcophagi or in paintings of what people in that part of Northern Africa looked like in the 1st century of the Common Era. And Jesus coming from, he spent time in Egypt, so he could have had African or Egyptian or what we think of today as Palestinian or Israeli or Middle Eastern heritage. I mean, it could have been a mix of different ethnic traditions, but roughly he came from a group of people that are medium to dark complected. That reality got shoved aside in favor of these increasingly radiant white portraits of Jesus through the Middle Ages and then into the modern period, both theologically and artistically. And so today we have white Jesus, but it's odd because just like he's Jewish, he's not, surprise, surprise, he's Jewish, and surprise, surprise,
he certainly wasn't Christian.
He wasn't white. Yeah, he wasn't Christian and he wasn't white. Yeah.
Interesting. I I think I want to have one more question in this spot, if that's okay.
Please. Yeah.
And I have some notes about the pagan continuity theory later
Uh-huh.
in regards to some of your interest in animism. But just to maybe help myself think my way through this question, if Christianity, in a sense, is starting to spread into Greece,
Mm-hmm.
and it's starting to pick up certain pagan traditions or Greek mystery rites, things starting to look like that.
Mm-hmm.
My instinct is to say, oh, it's not as if the Greeks, Greek washed Christianity.
Right.
They just sort of brought it into some things that they already knew.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible that the same, and in fact, there might be an argument that someone like Paul might have strategized in that direction and said, you know what, yeah, let's put these things
Right.
on this date, or
Right.
let's do it this
Right.
way because it seems to be sort of, close to what they're already doing.
Right.
Is it possible that as it spread in the opposite direction, that maybe the same thing happened? I think we like to think, or I'm sorry, it seems to be the instinct that, like, yeah, we shoved it aside. We, the Western white man, shoved the reality of his race aside. Is it possible that it might have been actually a strategic advantage to the people trying to spread the faith?
Sure. I was going to look for something here. I don't think I see it. Hold on for a second. I want to see if I can find something just to show you. No, I don't have it. But yes, I don't think in any way this was some strategic conspiratorial movement by white Europeans
Sure.
dictate to people what Jesus looked like according to the ethnic mores of their time. That would be too self-conscious and mechanical to make sense of this. I think over time, Jesus's ethnicity wasn't an issue. Then this document got popularized, in which he was understood in white, fair-haired, light-eyed, sort of European ideals of male beauty.
Hmm.
So I don't think it was conspiratorial. I think it was kind of an organic process. What I was looking for right here was, but over time, and really this is really recent, like in the last couple of 100 years, especially in the European and in the American context, this did become somewhat ideologically fixed. This Nordic image of Jesus as the dominant paradigm for understanding who he was. And what I was looking for was, I was struck 2 years ago, almost to the day, during the January 6th insurrection against the Capitol, that some of the individuals storming the Capitol carried around these huge portraits of Jesus, and they're both very they're very instructive and kind of comical, but it tells us something about how important these images are to our psyche. It's the white Jesus, the Scandinavian Jesus, the long hair and so forth, but he's got a MAGA hat on. So he's got it's white Jesus with this red MAGA hat, the Make America Great Again hat.
Sure.
And whatever one thinks about that movement, it became clear to me that movement saw a deep affinity between its own attempt to take back the election on behalf of Donald Trump, and the white Jesus tradition, as it were. That this is a Christian movement, that this is an evangelical, that this is a moral movement to claim the election for Donald Trump. So historically, this evolution took place in terms of the whitening of Jesus. But today, politically, I think it's more self-conscious. No one wants to recover the actual look of Jesus from 2,000 years ago. What they want is a white Jesus to kind of sacralize their political aspirations.
That's fascinating. When you were at the prep, when I first met you, did you happen to see in the back of the Jesu Church the Christ in North Philly tableau?
No,
Oh, it's
no.
fascinating. Yeah,
It was such a spectacular cathedral-like experience. I had no idea
yeah.
there was such um, a cathedral-like sanctuary
Hmm.
on the presence of St. Joe's Prep's campus. So I didn't see that. Well, what is that?
It is this incredible tableau in the back. You know how there's different little chambers going up all the way up.
Sure,
In
sure.
one of the back chambers, there is this tableau, and it's sort of built to be, I don't know if I'm using that word correctly, but it's kind of like a trifold wall with a mural of a Philadelphia street with the old cop cars and the old buildings and
Mm.
people kind of leaning out of the windows. And there's a whole scene going on, and each character is supposed to be a biblical character. And then there's a man who looks like he would have been from the neighborhood on what is a cross made out of telephone poles. So it's
Wow.
this, yeah, it's a very, very powerful image. I'm gonna find some images and send it to you.
I
But
would
if you're
love
ever in
to
the
see
area
that.
and you want to take a drive up on a Saturday, I'd be happy to show it to you. It's
Oh, I
wild.
would love to see that. I'm fascinated by, well, I think we all have an idea of what the conventional um, canonical sort of white Jesus looks like. I mean, not that we think of it as white Jesus, but stained glass Jesus, so to speak.
Sure.
But alternatives to that, that reminds me of the stained glass window that was given to the Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama,
Hmm.
in 1963, when 4 little girls were killed by white supremacists in a church bombing at a time when Martin Luther King Jr. rallied people in Birmingham to resist white domination.
Hmm.
And these 4 girls were killed, and much, well, not much, but a section of the church was destroyed in the basement area where the girls were preparing for the worship service and for the choir. And the people of Wales, of all places, got together, raised money, and commissioned a local artist to capture in glass, stained glass, an image of Jesus that spoke to the horror of that moment. And it's of a man, dark complected, but it's he is every man. It's in glass and color, but moderately dark complected. He has one hand as a kind of fist, or it's a warning in judgment against the bombing, but the other hand is open as an invitation to forgiveness. So how one can forgive people who kill children in a church, that's the mystery of grace, the mystery of the Christian message. But you have both gestures, judgment and grace and forgiveness with an open hand, and it's both true to the Christian imagery of Jesus, and it's also an innovation in a certain way. And that this sounds in the back of the I think of it as a cathedral, the church at St. Joe's Prep. This sounds similar to that. It's both true to the Christian message, but it's also innovative in certain ways.
I found an image online. I'm going to share my screen with you. Can you see this?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I can see that. Oh, wow. And this crucifix is a dark complected individual. And like the Egyptian portraits I was mentioning, one of the things that's distinctive about those portraits is that the individuals have not the flowing, auburn honey-colored hair
Sure.
of the Nordic Jesus, but like short cropped, kinky, dark, kinky, and curly hair, which is more characteristic of Semitic people and African and other people from that period. That's
Yeah,
really an interesting portrait.
it's worth a trip if you ever want to.
Yeah.
There's a history teacher, I think there are two actually, who know the history of the
Oh,
entire
look at this.
portrait, and there's apparently all this local history about who these people are.
Oh,
This woman I think is supposed to be Mary, and was
oh,
her last name was Green, and she actually took care of the Jesuits in Jesuit Hall that's right behind the Jesu.
oh,
So
yeah,
there's all these little sort of homages to the neighborhood.
I see that. I see that. And it's very Philadelphia with the row houses
Sure.
and the 3-story walk-ups. And I love also the loincloth around the Jesus figure, the crucified. You know, that bespeaks to me something more maybe African or alternate. It feels like an alternative pattern and design and color scheme to what I think of as traditional white European clothing.
Totally.
That's a beautiful image. And
Yeah,
is it done in plaster and paint? Is it?
I believe it. I know that the outline at least is wood, so I don't know if you can tell by the
But
corners
yeah,
of
I
the
can see
buildings are
that.
actually coming out. So they're
Oh,
that 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional.
right. So it has a kind of bas relief
Yes.
dynamic to it. It's both 2-dimensional flat, but it also, the use of perspective and different elements make it come out.
Sure. And to give you a sense of scale, to the left here is a confessional. So that's
Oh, I didn't see that.
probably, I bet that would be 7 or 8 feet tall. So the
Right.
whole thing is probably close to 10 feet tall.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for showing that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So that's one of your classes.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the one that you dropped too. What are the other 2 classes that you would normally teach? And is there any way of deciding which one you sort of keep on the menu?
Yeah. Swarthmore is very generous and flexible about encouraging faculty to teach their passions. So I have carte blanche and can teach a number of different topics broadly in the realm of religion, but I do a lot of work. You mentioned animism. I do a lot of work in my attempts academically to recover the tradition of so-called animism, the belief of traditional people that all things, even inanimate things like rocks and landscapes and rivers and the atmosphere itself, everything is alive and everything has the capacity for relationship and everything is sacred from a spiritual perspective. So I spend time with students rethinking animist traditions, doing comparative religion. And one of the classes that I often teach is simply called Religion and Ecology, which we focus on animist traditions or rethinking, in this case, the Christian tradition from an animist perspective. But then I do other classes. I teach a class just to first-year students called Apocalypse, in which we read literature about, see films about, and discuss the current situation of environmental, but also cultural apocalypse that afflicts our time.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we go down the ecology and animism?
Sure, please. Yeah.
Animism is sort of a dirty word. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Correct. That's exactly right.
What is that word? You could tell me. I mean, you could decide which context. How is that word understood? And it sounds like your attempt is to sort of reframe how it's understood. So how is it understood generally?
Yeah. So generally, it was the term, although it had a more ancient provenance, it became popular, at least in academic circles, in the 19th century because of a British anthropologist by the name of E.B. Tylor. And Tylor took the term and used it in a way that in some regards was incredibly insightful and heuristically productive as a way of understanding how First People or Indigenous people understand the whole world, the human and the more than human world, everything, plants, animals, rocks, trees, landscapes, the atmosphere, bodies of water, etc. Everything is from Tylor's perspective, and on this level, I think he's right. Everything was seen as ensouled, as having spirit, as everything is a bearer of soul or spirit. And this understanding then gave First People a sense of direct communion with and a feeling of kinship with what you might call the more than human world, because everything was animated and alive and in relationship with everything else according to this common spirit. And that got named and talked about in different ways for traditional cultures. The problem with Tylor, and this is why animism has become a dirty word, a pejorative put down of First Peoples, is that Tylor also thought that animism was a category for understanding the primitive, childlike nature of this belief in common spirit. So the word animism comes from the Latin word animus, which means spirit or soul. And so Tylor, while he used the term productively as a kind of analytical category, also in a pejorative and in an elitist and in actually a very racist way, believed that human societies have evolved over time from first people who were primitive and immoral and unformed in their understandings of the world to more moral societies that had eventually, surprise, surprise, fully realized human potential in late 19th century Christian Victorian culture and academia. And so this was a wedge term for him to distinguish civilization from, and I'll put these terms together here because Tylor used them this way, to distinguish civilization from heathen, pagan, superstitious, totemistic, animist societies, the dark cultures, as he called them, that had now been superseded in this evolutionary progression by the scientific, enlightened societies of Victorian England and Europe. So the term, that's its origin. It's both disclosive of a certain dynamic that I think needs to be recovered for our time, but also in a way that is sensitive to how the term has been used as a cudgel to denigrate and dehumanize tribal and traditional people.
Interesting. That part of the definition that sort of is dismissive and makes it sound childlike.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that misses? And is your class interested in sort of highlighting what that misses?
It misses that it basically, if you want to couch this in kind of contemporary pop neuropsychology terms, it misses the right brain. If the left brain, to use this kind of bicameral two hemisphere sort of metaphor, if the left brain is the linear, analytical, mathematical, scientific brain, the right brain is intuitive, artistic, emotional, spiritual. Both sides of the brain are necessary for healthy functioning for human individuals. Our society has become so infatuated with left brain linear thinking that we have either forgotten or become hostile to right brain intuitive thinking. Because of that, then the religion that we practice, and I'm particularly interested in the Christian religion, has taken on the cast or the tenor, the shape of rigid left brain totalizing thinking. And it has forgotten this other side of who we are: voices, dreams, magic, nature, music, art. This is all now relegated to the level of the personal and the interior, and what can't be academically or scientifically analyzed and organized. And so Tyler makes a step towards recovering this important category for understanding who we are, but then just as quickly undercuts his best insights in this tirade, really. In his book, it's a 2-volume book on so-called primitive cultures. While it starts off in a kind of dispassionate academic, with a sort of dispassionate academic tone, quickly degenerates into a kind of hysteria about the dangers of animist thinking.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Where does Tyler's work sit on the timeline in regards to Fraser's work? Because I know, not knowing too much about it, but having spoken to someone who wrote, I believe, some sort of outline or biography of his ideas, Fraser's ideas, there was quite a bit about magic in there.
Right.
And magic in relation to religion, in relation to science.
Right. So Fraser, Tyler, and other, especially British, but there were also European anthropologists of religion who did this. They're all cut from the same cloth. They all are involved in what you might call a supersessionist understanding of human progress, such that first people are seen as primitive and invested in dangerous occult superstitions like magic and fertility and healing rituals, non-scientific approaches to human well-being, which has now been superseded by so-called advanced civilized cultures. My work is is an exercise in trying to reverse that movement and return Western societies, and in particular Western religion and Christianity, return it back to its primordial earth-based animist origins. So I reread in a way that I think is much more true to the power and the meaning of, in this case, Christianity, the power and the meaning of Christianity. I reread the Christian tradition, the Bible, and the tradition of the early fathers and mothers of the church, and the theologians and the artists and everyone else involved in handing on the tradition of Christianity over the last 2 millennia, I reread the Christian tradition from the perspective of animism, or sometimes what I like to think, I'm taking the optics that I've used and I'm coloring them green, and I'm rereading the Bible and Christian tradition now with green optics. And from that perspective, all kinds of things come alive and pop out and emerge from the Bible and the tradition that I had never seen before. Because what I hadn't realized is that I had become captive to a kind of Western philosophical European understanding of what the Christian religion is. And while it certainly in many ways reflects that what Christianity is today, reflects that philosophical European trajectory, there's another trajectory or another layer of meaning that has been forgotten or suppressed. And that's the earth-based animist origins and dynamism of the Christian religion that has been largely suppressed.
I might be asking this out of turn, which should come to no surprise at this point. Is there any part of you that's confused in regards to that left brain, right brain dichotomy? It's not as if the Gospels are perfectly linear or logical.
Right.
And is there any part of you that's confused about what types of magic are allowed in the interpretation of the Bible and which types of magic aren't allowed?
Sure, of course, because I had, from college through seminary and graduate school, a certain kind of Tyler-like training that assumed this evolutionary progress from primitivism to civilization. That assumption was never examined. It was just baked into everything that I studied. So that gave me then a kind of, if this makes sense, Kevin, a kind of false coherence about the Christian message. Today,
Total sense.
in challenging that false coherence, I end up with something much more interesting and much more powerful, but also strange and foreign and at times incoherent. I'll give you some examples of this. So there are many stories in the Bible that, and I'll just take some of the Gospels. I mean, we could talk about other parts of the Bible, other parts of the Christian scriptures, but just to take the Gospels, the stories about Jesus, that don't make sense from the from the evolutionary perspective, let's call it. When Jesus is traveling into Jerusalem as towards what we learn to become the latter part of his life, and as he's approaching Jerusalem, he encounters a fig tree. And you probably know this story, but it's not bearing fruit. And from his perspective, that fig tree in that particular season should bear fruit, should have figs. Now, this tells us a lot about Jesus as an arborist, as a person who experienced intimacy with non-human life forms like trees. He understood their cycles, their seasons, their rhythms. But what's really strange about the story is he gets pissed off and angry at the tree. I don't know, does he really like figs a lot? Is he hungry? Is he had a bad day? I'm not sure what's going on. But he gets so angry with the fig tree, he curses it and says, you'll never bear figs again, because I arrived on this day and I expected to have figs, and there are no figs here, and you're cursed forever.
Sure.
Now, this is God's son who, okay, yeah, like you got up on the wrong side of the bed, that whatever. But I think there's something going on here. I think he had relationships. This is where we're getting into something strange, and
Sure.
um,
I'm all for it.
yeah, why the right-wing media has attacked my radical Jesus class and so forth. But this is where, in my mind, Jesus, it's clear to me that he has a relationship with trees. They are beings with emotions and capacities for a relationship that he intuitively accepts. Animist people will say things like, all of us are persons, only some of us are human persons. We're human beings, but there are the bird people and the rock people and the sky people and the water people. There are also the tree people. They are beings with personalities, emotional lives, and abilities to relate to other beings. Much of this we don't understand because it's not it's not surprising. We're locked within our own paradigms as the human persons. I didn't grow up that way. I thought there were human beings, and then there were some other things like, animals and maybe some plants that had a certain kind of capacity for decision making, and then everything else was kind of dead, inert matter. Rocks and landscapes and rivers and so forth. But what I'm suggesting is that Jesus in the first century of the Common Era would have been just like all the other people in his time, who also experienced the world animistically, as a living place, not as dead matter. And he encountered trees that way. We often don't see that because we don't think, we don't see it because it would never occur to us that Jesus, or anybody for that matter, could actually talk to a tree. If I see you at the prep, next week when we visit that beautiful work of art, talking to a tree,
Right. You might get back in your car.
I'm going to be like, Kevin,
It's gone too far.
This has been great, but I just can't go there. Yeah. I don't know what you're trying to get out of this. I don't know what you're doing, but you had too much to drink.
Sure.
Whatever. Something is going on. But here he has this long conversation with a tree. And when I now reread the Bible and the tradition with green eyes, example after example after example of this strange world that Jesus inhabited comes alive. I don't exactly know what to call it. You can call it magic, animism, paganism, nature spirituality, Celtic Christianity. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to understand this, but it is definitely and strikingly at odds with the way I was raised to inherit the Christian tradition.
Sure. How much, so you read something like that with green eyes, suddenly you're afraid to even say that you think that maybe Jesus had some sort of connection with these trees, right?
Right. I don't want to, I'm saying this privately to you, and no one will ever hear this.
Right.
And we can forget about it. Yes.
Right. But I'm sure the first time you woke up after you thought that, you were like, do I choose to just forget that I thought that?
Right.
Do I choose to pursue that? What was your next instinct as far as what you start to read to verify that or stress test that? I'm curious, at the risk of leading you, did you then start wondering, okay, well, if Jesus was a Jewish man at that time, are there any traces of this sentiment towards non-living beings, or, however we want to put it, trees or objects or whatever?
Sure.
Are there any of these sentiments in the Jewish tradition or parts of the Jewish tradition?
Right. And so there are, and so it's part of me, for analytical purposes, wants to say that the Christian tradition represents a confluence of two other traditions. One is, you could call it, and you alluded to this earlier, Greek, or maybe Greek and Roman, but just Greek paganism on the one hand, and the tradition of the Israelites and the temple, what became Judaism, and the tradition of the rabbis. So there are these two streams that came together in the formation of Christianity, pagan and ancient Israelite. But that's too neat and tidy. Those traditions are also flowing in and out of each other prior to and during the time of Jesus. So you have this Israeli-Palestinian individual in first century Palestine, a region that is now occupied by a foreign power, namely Rome. And you have people then who are both, much like our own time, inheritors of ancient wisdom traditions about relationships with trees and talking animals and living landscapes, and people who are being educated, so-called educated, by the Greeks and the Romans according to traditions of reading and writing and the beginnings of science and so forth. So it's not surprising that, to me, just talking about the New Testament, that we have this ebb and flow between kind of educated perspectives on reality and more primordial understandings of reality. Another quick example of this, in the Gospel of Mark, I think it's the 8th chapter, there's a really strange story, like talking to the tree, where Jesus heals a man, and the man is blind, and when Jesus, well, he spits in his face, so that's interesting, we talk about that, but after spitting in his face and after the man literally pulls the saliva out of his eyes, Jesus says, "What do you see?" And the man says, "I see trees like people walking about." And that's weird. I mean, are you not seeing properly? Do you think trees and people are the same? Or, it's just not clear from the story what's going on. And then Jesus spits in his face again. And the man now pulls back the saliva, and the text says he sees clearly. And then Jesus says, "Don't tell anybody what just took place here. Just go on your business." There's a lot of strange things about that story.
Yeah.
But traditionally, how it's been understood is that, well, the man was only partially healed in the first place, and then he was fully healed in the second place. Well, you see how that's an odd, all the commentary, the sacred, traditional, canonical commentary by Christians from 2,000 years that I've read on that text, all say that. This is an instance of progressive, gradual healing. Really? I thought Jesus healed people. I thought that was the whole point of the story. Why would you write a story where the first crack at the bat, he fails? The guy can only partially see. And then, boom, now he sees really well. He doesn't see trees and people commingled. So my point is, I think the commentators all have it wrong. I don't think it's a story about failed healing. I think it's a story in which Jesus is healing the man in different ways. And at first, the man sees nature and people as one. And then the man sees nature, the non-human world, and human beings as two, as separate. I think the point of the story is that both ways of seeing are critical to the man's healing. And that Jesus doesn't polemicize against the first healing. That healing is complete and sufficient unto itself. It's just not all that Jesus wants to do. If to go back to that language of the two hemispheric regions of the brain, in the first instance, Jesus heals the man's right brain. He's seeing everything as one. And then Jesus heals the man's left brain. Now the man with the left brain, as it were, can start to distinguish between humans and non-humans. But the point of the story isn't that that's the only way to understand humans and trees. There's another way to understand humans and trees, and Jesus seems to celebrate that and value that, and that's that they are in some sense fundamentally one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Having heard that story before, it's fascinating that that line that stuck out to me was, I don't know what the actual line is, but don't tell anybody what happened here, just sort of
Right,
go on.
right.
That takes on a whole another tone when you consider, like, perhaps the guy saw something that would be startling.
Would be
And
startling.
I always sort of interpreted that line as like, oh wow, look how humble Jesus is. He fixed this guy, and now he doesn't actually want the word to get out. And now it's suddenly like, oh wait, whoa,
Right.
did this guy see something that maybe he wasn't ready for, or who knows? That's fascinating.
It's a strange thing, Kevin, that if you think about that, the point of the Gospels is to present Jesus as a savior, as a healer. And they were written in a very straightforward Greek so that any educated reading person could read the stories, understand them, and disseminate their content to others. Why, if that's the point, why would you present Jesus in such a way that his first healing in that story fails? That doesn't make sense. And apropos your point, why would you present the story in such a way that then Jesus tells people not to tell people what just happened? And that's a theme throughout the Gospels, but it's especially characteristic of the first three Gospels. And scholars call that the messianic secret. It's Jesus being at pains to tell people, especially people that he's healed, not to tell anyone else about what's happened. And there's a lot of, I think, interesting scholarship about why he would have done that.
Interesting. So I'm sorry, the messianic secret
Oh, the messianic secret.
is used by scholars to refer to that sort of interpretation of the story that I had at first, which is actually don't go tell people that I'm here.
Exactly. Don't tell anyone about this. He's at pains to, like we're talking about the Gospel of Mark here, throughout the Gospel of Mark, after a healing, to instruct people not to tell anyone about what's happened. He also tells people that he's healed that he doesn't want them to follow him. In Mark 5, when he heals sometimes what's called the Gerasene demoniac, a man who was left to scream at the sky and the moon at night because he was possessed by demons and he's held together with chains. It's a horrifying, horrifying story. Jesus heals the man. The people in the town become afraid that Jesus has healed the man, according to the Gospel of Mark. And they tell Jesus they want him to leave. Okay, that's odd. I mean, you'd think they'd want him to be there and to heal people like this man, but they don't like this. And when the man wants to follow Jesus, Jesus says, you can't follow me. So this, there was a German scholar named Willem Wrede, W-R-E-D-E. Wrede was the scholar who popularized that phrase, the messianic secret, because he recognized that this was a theme throughout the first three Gospels in particular. And then the speculation is why. Why would Jesus be at pains to tell people to not reveal his identity if the whole point of the Gospels is to reveal his identity?
Interesting. Is that demonic story? Is that where the demons go into the birds? Is that?
Yeah,
that
they
story?
go, that's right, but they go into a flock, they go into a herd of pigs.
Oh, okay.
And the pigs then race off a cliff and drown themselves or are
Interesting.
drowned at the base of the cliff. And the people recoil in horror at this, the people in this town, and they tell Jesus to leave. Why? I mean, Don't you, wouldn't it make sense for them if they care about this man who's up in the graveyard howling at the moon at night, when they say, this is amazing what you've done. You've healed our fellow citizen, our towns member. Come have a meal with us. Tell us how you did this. No, they recoil in horror and they tell him to leave.
It would be pretty alarming to me.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so so I can't fault them too much.
No, I get it. I think that's what I love about the Gospels is, and the whole Bible is this way. It actually taps into what it means to be human. The reactions, the emotional reactions, are consistent with what we think and feel most of the time. And I agree. I'd be like, great that you healed this guy, but we don't want you around. We got used to his stuff. Now the magic or whatever it is you're doing is just too novel and terrifying. Yeah.
That's interesting. When you have these green glasses on, you have to light up when you read non-canonical gospels like the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of that line. I'm going to butcher this, but sort of, pick up the rock and there I am. Or
Yes.
cleave the branch or something and there I am.
Yes.
Anytime you want to cite a so-called Gnostic gospel, you're sort of in an uphill battle. As a scholar, do you feel inclined to point to those things, or do you try to kind of stick in what people have decided is the canon? What's your instinct there?
Yeah. So it's a really good question. And I love the Gnostic Gospels. They're just whatever you think about the process in which the canonical Gospels became central to the received tradition of sacred literature, and now what we consider to be non-canonical Gospels and other writings were left on the cutting room floor. However that process took place, it is fascinating to read the canonical New Testament and the Bible itself with green eyes. God speaks to Moses through a bush. God comes to Job in a whirlwind. Jesus talks to trees, et cetera, et cetera. That you see the same themes, the same animist worldview at play in the Gnostic Gospels as well. And the Gospel of Thomas, which scholars think, some scholars call it the fifth gospel. Some scholars, because it was often referred to by the patristic and other apostolic writers as a kind of book to be included along with what we think of now as the canonical four gospels, but also some of the dating of the Gospel of Thomas. Some scholars have gone so far as to date it as earlier or as the earliest gospel writing, even older than what has been understood as the Gospel of Mark, which was probably written around 60 to 70 of the Common Era. Thomas seems to refer to traditions even older than Mark. I'm conflicted on this point, and it's not my particular area of focus, but it's to say that there was a much more flexible, in the first 2 centuries of Christianity, a much more flexible understanding as to which of the biographies of Jesus were the most authoritative. But to your point, you have, like the passages that you cited in Thomas, you have this understanding basically in the way that, for example, the Gospel of John understands God in the world. When in the prologue to John's Gospel in the first chapter, the writer says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. There seems to be in John this understanding of God infleshing God's self, paradigmatically in Jesus, but correspondingly in all things. John seems to work with the notion of all things as the enfleshment or the incarnation of divinity. And certainly Thomas and those references, to look under a rock and there you will find me.
Sure.
Jesus in the Gospel of Luke says, you're looking for the kingdom of God. He says, it's everywhere.
Hmm.
The kingdom of God is everywhere. It's right here. It's right in front of you. It's everywhere. It's not a particular thing or a particular place or a cathedral or a built site or a church or a temple. The kingdom of God, he says, is in your midst. And I think that's a reflection of this animist sensibility that divinity is everywhere, and everything in that sense now is a bearer of the sacred.
When you first said messianic secret, I immediately thought to the conversation that Jesus has with Thomas,
Mhm.
and where he comes back and everyone's like, oh, well, what did he say? And he's like, if I told you what he said, you would stone me to death.
I know.
And I sometimes, when I read the Gospel of Thomas, I speculate, and I had the great fortune to actually speak with Elaine Pagels and ask her
Oh, oh,
what she thinks Jesus might, and it's a crazy question, but what do you
right,
think he might have said?
right.
And she asked me, she said, well, what do you think? And I said, I have a suspicion that I could guess at what you might think based on what I've read, right? So I just kind of kept going back and forth. And I have a recording of it. It's on that list at some
Yeah.
point. And I guessed, I said, well, I have a feeling that Jesus said something pretty wild, like, I'm sort of something like very non-dualist, like I and the Father in one, and so are you.
Yeah,
It's something as simple as that. And
right,
I forget exactly how I phrased it, but she seemed to agree with that. I would have loved for her to have articulated it,
right,
given her expertise.
right.
But that's sort of in the back of my mind, is like, what is the actual messianic secret? And is it something like this is it something akin to other themes that we see throughout the Bible, like consubstantiality?
Yeah,
And
right.
is it okay, well, if Jesus and the Father are one and we're his brothers and sisters, is there a part of Jesus's message that maybe is a little more esoteric and maybe not as public facing, which is, hey, we are actually all of the same substance in some really important
Yeah,
physical way, and also in some really important philosophical way?
yeah, yeah. I think, Kevin, you're onto something profoundly important, and it really makes, I think, the Christian tradition stand out as something um, startling in its claim about incarnation. It, if you think about it, um, the so-called doctrine of incarnation has been thinned out and reduced to an understanding of God enfleshing God's self in the person of Jesus. But I don't think that's all that it is. It is that. And so Jesus becomes a paradigm or a model for us of what it means to be truly human, is to live in ready openness to God's voice and God's presence in our life. But I don't think it's only about one-time infusing of God's self in this one mortal body. I think it's a sign or a symbol or a finger pointing to God. And this might be what Jesus didn't want to say publicly. Maybe this is the secret message, is that all things are infusions of divine spirit. God has um, um, promiscuously in flesh God's self in everything. And you get clues to this, like in Thomas, when Jesus says, I'm everywhere, just look under the rock. When Jesus in Luke says, where's the kingdom of, it's everywhere. and also, and this is something I focused on in a book I recently did called When God is a Bird. As I began to reread the New Testament with green eyes and read it in its original language, I realized that, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, the writer says, when Jesus was baptized, the Spirit came down upon Jesus, like it alighted upon him, hovered around him, in bodily form as a dove.
Hmm.
And that's as blunt and as literal as the New Testament's description of Jesus being God's enfleshment. And so what I think has been missed, and this is upsetting to many Christians, but be that as it may, what's been missed is that really the message, the Christian message, is about a double incarnation, if you want to put it that way, or multiple incarnations. God enfleshed God's self in human form, but God also enfleshed God's self in animal form, specifically as that birdie dove, that birdie spirit in the Gospels, and that theme is not only in the 4 canonical Gospels. It's also in, and I forget which one. It's also, is it Philip? It's also in at least one of the other non-canonical Gospels. That same story is told about the Spirit of God, in the way I put it is, the Spirit of God enfeathers itself in the dove, or in the Greek, it's also the same word for pigeon. Maybe it was a pigeon. The Spirit enfeathered itself in the pigeon that hovered around Jesus at the time.
How inconvenient that would be.
Yeah.
If it were a pigeon, we would hate that.
I know.
Of all the birds, I mean, a dove is, a dove you can have some sympathy for, but a pigeon.
I know. And it also goes to, in our churches, we see this virginal white dove. That's pretty rare. I mean, occasionally you see a dove like that,
right.
But pigeons are everywhere.
Mm.
And how wonderfully ridiculous and commonplace is this? And they've always been everywhere. For 2,000 years, from the Middle East to the present, we've had pigeons everywhere. The word in Greek is peristera, and it literally means pigeon. Now, that got stained glassed. So
yeah, you gotta beef that up a little bit.
It could just be the everyday common pigeon.
I'm surprised the same people who stormed the Capitol with the thing with the sign of Jesus, they didn't rewrite it to be an eagle.
Yes. Yeah. You could have done that. You could have had, a regal eagle, some grand raptor, some majestic bird, but it wasn't that. It was a common everyday pigeon that was, for Christians who think in Trinitarian terms, that God is one, but reveals God's self as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? The Holy Spirit, God, is a pigeon.
Yeah.
And when you say that, it sounds crazy.
Right.
But that is, I think, the lost treasure, or the lost tradition that has been suppressed, but is all throughout both the canonical and, as you were asking about, the non-canonical literature.
I have a serious question, but I'll tuck it behind a less serious question. Do you have a sense that what's very frustrating about your claim of the double incarnation, do you think people are like, hey, Mark, it took us 2,000 years to figure out the trilogy. We can't be adding new people to this.
Yeah, don't add, please. We're not even sure
of
what
the Trinity
means.
Yeah.
But don't
complicated.
mess with this, because it's too complicated. I think the way I think of it, it's a great question. Think about Trinity as theological grammar, not a doctrine that we need to get right. So if you think about theology as grammar, not doctrines, it doesn't mean that you can't articulate doctrines. God is 1 and 3, okay? That's doctrine. But what that means grammatically is that you try to think in that way.
Hmm.
So there are, you can't say anything in English, but there's a lot of things you can say. But there is a grammar that we all adhere to so that we can communicate.
Hmm.
And I think that's what, at that level, the Bible and Christian tradition is trying to give us a grammar, a framework that we can then use to think through and live through the implications of faith. And I mean, it's magical to me that Christianity is grammatically Trinitarian. But what that means then is that the Holy Spirit has to be accounted for. And it has been, but that as the animal, what I think of as the animal face of God. There's the human face of God, but there's also the animal face of God. God, to paraphrase Mother Teresa, in all of God's many and wondrous disguises.
Hmm.
And one of the disguises, one of the faces, one of the means that God presents God's self to us is as an animal, as a pigeon.
Hmm. This is now the more serious question. Thanks for playing ball with that. The double incarnation, am I saying that right?
Yes,
This
double incarnation. Right.
double embodiment argument that you make. Is it ubiquitous or is it selective? Is it one bird at one time, or are you saying all birds? And then what do we do with that poor fig tree that was damned?
I know that gets damned. So that's a really, really good question. Think about how Christianity has struggled with that since
Sure.
the lost tradition of the animal God has slipped away from us. That's tragic to me. But we do still have the tradition of the human God, Jesus, the embodiment of God, the flesh of God. The word became flesh and dwelled among us. So we have that tradition. And think of how, thinking of that tradition now again as grammar, as a grammatical rule, think of how we struggle with that. Mother Teresa, everyone I see is the face of God, but I don't like these people. I mean, this is, what she wrote later in her journals that people didn't know about. And I struggle in my feelings, and I feel guilt about how I don't want to be with the poor. But this is Christ in our midst. This is who Jesus, where is Jesus today? He is the poor. What you do to the least of my brothers, you do it to me. You say you did this and you that, but I was in prison. You didn't visit me. I was naked. You didn't clothe me. I was hungry. You didn't feed me. So where were you? And people are like, what are you talking about? I never saw you naked. I know, because those that were naked and in prison and hungry and poor, that was me. That's who I am. We struggle with this in Christianity. We struggle with what that means, but at least we have that struggle, Kevin. You know what I'm saying? Like with Mother Teresa, we struggle with the one-time revelation of God in Jesus and the ongoing revelation of God in all of us. And isn't that the Christian message, that we should treat each other as God in our midst? So what I'm suggesting is that we now need to extrapolate from that, the human world, the face of God in the human world, to the more than human world. I think the Christian tradition is incredibly rich with beautiful, sometimes terrifying, but beautiful portraits of divinity in animal faces and in plant faces and in rock faces and landscapes and water. And I mean, it's everywhere. And it's so rich that and destabilizing to our human-centered, anthropocentric culture, that we don't want to go there. But in fact, in response to your question, I do think the Christian tradition teaches that God is in all things. Now, what that means, how we then comport ourselves to the non-human others as the face of divinity, I don't know. I don't know. Can we eat? Can we eat non-human animals as food? I mean, Jesus, the morning of his resurrection in the Gospel of John, has a fish breakfast with his disciples.
Hmm.
Is he consuming God? I mean, you know what I mean? There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, fascinating. The Mother Teresa thing, my immediate response to that is, yes, of course the tradition struggles with it, and we have her there demonstrating that. But she's our third hitter. She's the best among us,
Right.
struggling mightily to do the thing that we're called to do in that case.
I agree. And in her humanity, not wanting to do it.
Is that the baseball? Who's the important baseball? The important baseball hitter would be the fourth hitter or the leadoff? I don't know.
Well, when I heard third hitter, I thought of, there's the leadoff guy.
That's what I'm thinking.
There's the guy that follows him. Then there's the third hitter that precedes the cleanup hitter. But you know what I mean? The third hitter plays an important role. They're not the leadoff. They're not the cleanup guy. They're also not at the bottom of the order, but they play an important role. And she plays an important role. But I appreciate her devotion to God's broken body in our midst, and in her humanity, her repulsion at the work that she's being called to do.
And I also agree that we struggle with that idea of the many faces of God, as you put it, I think earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Even ritualistically, if you don't mind me asking, are you Catholic or Christian?
So I was raised Protestant.
Okay.
And then, how can I say this? I just became too enamored by Catholic traditions, Orthodox traditions, and the Protestant traditions that I was raised with. I just think of myself as caught up in the wonder of the rich growth of Christianity throughout the ages, including the ways in which Christianity has become at times integral with, in both healthy and really unhealthy ways, indigenous communities. Indigenous practices of Christianity, Native American and others, really is fascinating to me. And they don't fit the typical tripartite structure of, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. And I'm caught up in that conversation as well. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, in the Catholic tradition, should you walk into a Catholic church on Sunday, there is this ritual, as you obviously know, this very solemn ritualistic transformation of what is thought to be the Spirit of God into the Eucharist, the bread and the wine. What's interesting to me in regards to your theories and in your arguments is that it's almost as if that ritual has something right, that God could be so many things.
I agree.
But then we also have this reverence for the ritual that can't happen anywhere else. It's this blood, I'm sorry, this bread, bread and this wine.
Right.
But it's not the bread or the wine I might be having 2 days from now or later that night.
You're right. And this is analogous to your earlier question about, well, as Christians, we don't disagree with the postulate that God incarnated God's self in Jesus. But what does that mean about other people? Is that just one time? Or, you know what I'm saying? The tension that we feel rightly, I think, about the one-time revelation versus God consistently revealing God's self in all persons, I think is that problem of the, you could call it the problem of the particular and the universal. You can analogize from that to what now you're talking about. We have the particular bread and wine, enfleshing God's Spirit, God's presence in the midst of the community, Eucharistically, in consecrated elements. And yet, doesn't that tell us something about universally God's presence in our midst? If in principle, any bread and any wine now ritually consecrated can be Eucharist, then perhaps sacramentally the world and all things in it participate in that sacrament, make it come alive, and in turn are outworkings of the sacramental power that we see in that one moment. I guess what I'm trying to get at here, Kevin, is that Jesus concretizes and intensifies what is always already happening. God breathing into, manifesting into, pouring God's self into all things. And I think the Eucharist functions in the same way. I think it's an intensification of what we always already know. Where's the kingdom of God? It's everywhere.
I get that. That was beautiful, by the way. I get the sense that very serious theologians, much like yourself, would not take someone like Alan Watts very seriously. But I heard a quote once, and I'm not sure why that is, but I also don't pretend to know
Yeah.
the legitimate reasons, if there were any. I heard once in an interview he was asked if he believed that Jesus was the Son of God, and he had this incredible answer that sounded very similar to some version of what you just said, which is, he said, I believe, and I might be butchering this a little bit, he said, I believe that Jesus was a Son of God, a very, very important Son of God, who came to tell us that we are too.
Right. So
Is that too wild?
It's not too wild, and I know his work, and I understand his religious quest insofar as I've read his work and I've watched some older videos of him. As a Christian thinker, I wouldn't put it that way. I'm not saying he's wrong. I just wouldn't put it. That to me is not true to the grammar of,
if I could annotate it,
Christian faith. Yeah.
I think my interpretation, at least of some parts of our conversation, is that there's almost this instinct to be like, oh God, is someone saying that they're also the Son of God? Like, that freaks us out, right? But then it doesn't freak us out when someone really charitably says that poor person is the face of God and that poor person is the face of God.
Right.
So I don't know if that's sort of jamming us up there, but there's a part of it that seems true when we want to give it to other people. And believe me, I'm not saying like, give it to yourself, but we seem to be at least okay with like Mother Teresa's The Many Masks of God or The Many Faces of God or something. But then as soon as we're like, yeah, we're, as soon as you make it first person, people get a little freaked out, which I understand why.
Right.
But there is this second person plural, if I'm getting that right, where it's like, okay, everybody else is though.
And in that spirit, I understand what you're saying, and also Alan Watts. I get the gesture of openness and charity to all, and I like that. I'm a bit hamstrung by the traditional grammar of Christianity, but I understand it differently than I think other theologians. I think of Jesus's claim to divine sonship in performative, not metaphysical terms. This is what I mean by that. And there was a 19th century German religious thinker named Friedrich Schleiermacher who made this point. Jesus is what we all could become, but we're probably not going to get there. I'm certainly not going to get there.
Sure.
He lived in the full potency of his God consciousness. He lived in the full reality of his potential to be in ready openness and relationship with his Father. I don't think that Jesus is some deus ex machina. He's not some being that comes down out of the sky and plops down onto the planet, just visiting for a while, and isn't fully human only appears to be human. What he really is a divinity with kind of human clothing, with the appearance of being human. That was a popular option in early Christianity, and I get why people want to go there.
Sure.
It sort of makes logical sense. Some early Gnostics, also some early Muslims, couldn't imagine that if Jesus were God's son, that he would die an ignominious death as a common criminal on a cross. They didn't question the crucifixion. They just said it wasn't Jesus. It was an imposter. Jesus had already taken off, had switched his, masterminded an imposter to take over his role, and it was that individual that was killed on the cross. Okay, there are a lot of these theories. That's just one of them to make sense of this. What happened in Christianity, the Orthodox received tradition, was to say, and this makes no sense propositionally, it does make sense grammatically. Jesus was fully, without confusion and without separation, fully human and fully divine. He's both at the same time, without division and without confusion. So what that to me means is that he lived in the full realization of his potential, which we could too. Otherwise, we're not the same as him. You can see where I'm going with this.
Sure.
We've got to be the same as him. We've got to have the same flesh, the same temptations, the same insecurities, the same fears, etc. We are broken flesh, and Jesus was broken flesh. But in spite of that, in spite of his humanity, maybe that's not the way I want to say it, alongside his humanity, through his humanity, he realized his potential. Fully.
And that's what you mean by performative, not metaphysical.
Performative, not metaphysical. In that sense, unlike Watt, I would say he is the Son of God.
Interesting.
He did it.
Yeah.
And you might do it.
Sure.
And you could then claim that. I'm not going to get there.
Yeah.
This is not going to happen. So, there were many times when he could have, if I'm being tortured on a cross and somebody says to me, screw you, you could have helped us and you didn't. And I'm like, anyways, I could imagine what my reaction would have been.
Sure. And it wouldn't have been his.
No.
Huh. Okay. Let me see if I can try to piece this together. And I don't know if we're going to be able to end with a really nice, neat question, but a good question might suffice. Okay. So he's the Son of God.
Yeah.
In performance. He and God are one in performance, not metaphysically.
Yeah.
But then we say things like that person is the face of God.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, that other person is God's face. Yes.
And I don't want to I don't want to be too stubborn on this point, but I'm just curious, why do you aim the critical function at yourself and not the other person when you give the mask of God to them? It's not like you're like, well, they're not fully actualized.
Right.
You're like that beggar is not full. They have not reached their potential. There's no part of you that says that. And there's no part of, it seems like the Christian ethos isn't to say that, of course. And it shouldn't be, right? But then when we look inward, it's like, well, I haven't fulfilled that same potential. It's like, well, you could be the beggar that somebody else is saying is the face of God, right?
I think I like that a lot, Kevin. I
hope that's not confusing.
No, I think that's the mystery of the Christian tradition. Think about who Jesus was. He was a homeless individual living in an occupied imperial state with no resources, no money, no future, no potential, nothing. So as a houseless person living under occupation with a potential for realizing his true identity as, which I think all of us could do, but we're not going to get there probably. Realizing his full potential as God's son, as God's child. And that's going to be a lot more like that houseless person who's begging for food. Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to put his head. Right?
And even at his birth.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the whole message, it's a really weird message. You're trying to communicate this glorious story about this, this sovereign over the whole universe, God, and you do it through stories about poverty and homelessness and disease and chronic mental instability, horrific relations with his parents, with his family of origin. They think he's crazy. The Gospel of Mark opens with his family trying to wrestle him to the ground to get him to stop talking about the stuff that he likes to talk about. And he's like, that person over there, she's not even my mother. I don't care what she says. You're my mother. You're my brothers. You're my sister. Who talks like this?
Sure.
Who does that? That's not filial piety. That's a direct confrontation with everything that we consider to be sacred and holy in our society. He did this again and again. A man wants to follow him, and all he wants to do is bury his father. Right? He said, I want to follow you. My father just died. Why? That's being noble, and that's an honor. Jesus says, let the dead bury the dead. Then you can come follow me. Who talks that way? So I think what we've got here is somebody who is moved away from much of the conventional thinking and styles of living in our society that we hold to be sacrosanct. And to what I'm suggesting performatively, to live out the full potency of his God awareness. And that means then that's Jesus is not going to be my favorite priest on Sunday morning consecrating the Eucharist. And he's not going to be, I could go on and on and on about religious figures and guardians of orthodoxy. That's just not, I'm not saying those people aren't God's children or the face of God to us. That they are, or they can be. But here's a good example of how strange, if Jesus were to come back today, how impossible it would be to figure this out. There was a church group in, I think this was in Portland, and I used this in my Radical Jesus class, who wanted to test whether if they put a sculpture of Jesus on a park bench, and it was really well done. It looked like it was made out of some sort of, flesh-like material. So it's this full length sculpture. And like on a Saturday night, they plopped him on the park bench. If you look at it, it's Jesus, right? I mean, like white Jesus, he's got the beard and the hair and the robes and stuff. Immediately, people milling around the park called the police. There's this homeless guy sleeping on a park bench. That's against the law. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. That was the point of that whole exercise by that church group. We wouldn't even know. We wouldn't have a clue what he would be like, who he would be if he showed up today. We call and get him arrested. And I think that's kind of where we are. And I think I want to preserve that all of us have the potential to be God's children. It's just that most of us aren't going to get there.
That's fascinating. No, I appreciate that perspective. I've never heard it articulated quite like that. That makes a ton of sense. Have you ever read Gabriel Garcia Marquez's an enormous man, a very old man with enormous wings or something like that, where the angel falls into a village and then they're left to try to figure out what to do with this angel?
No, not this isn't in 100 Years of Solitude. It's something else.
No, yeah, it's a separate, just a short
Oh, it's like
story.
a short story?
Yeah, I'll
What's
follow
it?
up with an email and I'll include
Okay,
it.
all right, I would love that.
But
So
they just
so
torture him. They open a zoo. It's a very similar point. And
oh,
it's fascinating.
so they recognize that this is a divine being.
Right, and then they start selling tickets to go see the divine being. Yeah, it becomes it's bad. It's rough. It's right.
My favorite example of this is in just similar to Gabriel Garcia Marquez in Dostoevsky's novel, The Grand Inquisitor. There's a chapter the novel is called The Brothers Karamazov.
Sure.
There's a chapter called The Grand Inquisitor. So at the height of the Spanish Inquisition, burning of so-called infidels at the stake, the Grand Inquisitor, the primary official for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the time, Jesus comes back. So 1,500 years later, he shows up. Nobody recognizes him because he doesn't say anything. He's dressed like a common person. But the
Sure.
Grand Inquisitor recognizes him. He says, "What are you doing here?"
Hmm.
Jesus doesn't say anything. And the Grand Inquisitor says, "Look, I won't use bad language here. You screwed everything up."
You can.
Yeah, thank you. You fucked everything up.
Sure.
You promised people freedom, independence, living according to the dictates of their own hearts. That doesn't work. We offer something else. We give them miracles, authority, and bread. That's what people want. Miracles, authority, and we have it all here. And if you step out of line, we burn you at the stake.
Sure.
And the Inquisitor says, "What are you going to do about this? We don't want you here. We don't need you anymore." And at the end of the story, Dostoevsky writes that Jesus never says anything throughout the account, walks up to the man, and he kisses him on his cold, bloodless lips. And then he walks out. So it's that, in the name of Christianity and the church, we are doing what we are now doing. And it may have, sometimes it has a lot to do with, I think, Jesus's message, but sometimes it has nothing to do.
It's fascinating. There's a line of Flannery O'Connor, "A Good Man Is Hard to Find," where
I know that story. Yeah.
the grandmother's sort of muttering like, "Oh, Jesus, Jesus," and I forget what the guy's name is. I think it's the Misfit, right? Or
The Misfit. Yeah.
Right. He sort of says Jesus screwed the whole thing up, and
yes, that's exactly right. He screwed everything up. We should have been people, and that's of course what we've become, that fall in line with political and religious authority. And he taught a kind of soul-based independence. And that we can't accommodate that in organized society. We can't accommodate Jesus coming back as that park bench guy and falling asleep on the park bench in Portland. We don't want that. So
I'm painfully aware of the time, and I'm laughing because at some point I thought we were going to be able to do this in an hour. I want to ask you 100 questions about how you got your green pair of glasses, but maybe just to punctuate between possibly another conversation at some point, if you're willing.
Yeah.
Some very practical advice. How would you recommend if you had a young, eager person, I'm asking for a friend,
right,
who wanted to try on these green glasses? Is there a concrete activity you would recommend that they go?
There's a good way to start with it. I don't see it here on my shelf, but there is a really interesting, so a great way to do this. It's harder to do it with the tradition, the fathers, the mothers, the Augustine to the present, Thomas. It's harder to do this, but with the Bible, there's an edition of the Bible now called, I think it's called, Kevin, the Green Bible. I might not have that right. It might be something else, but I think that's right. But if you remember traditions of the Bible that would put in red print everything that when God or Jesus is speaking, the red letter edition. So this is the green letter edition. And every time something is said, when God creates Adam, the first human out of the dust of the earth, that's all put into green type. It's God doing something in relation to the earth. And of course, person that I am, I think they miss a lot of things that should be in green type.
Sure.
But as a first move towards reading the Christian Bible with green eyes, that's a good place to start.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I really truly enjoyed this conversation, and I'll cut the recording and then I'll sign off
Sure.
offline. Awesome.
Great.
Thank you.